The camera.
The camera there. I just realized I haven't filmed a video in a long while and it's gonna be so awkward with someone else here, but that's fine, I'll power through. We're literally just talking to no one and we're just talking to a camera.
Yeah.
But you know what?
Let's just roll with it.
Let's just roll with it. It's been a while since I uploaded a video. I think the last video I uploaded was an update to let people know I'm still alive. And I guess this could still be an update to let people know, yeah, I'm still alive. That video was like 4 months ago. But yeah, I'm still alive. I am with a friend.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I'm doing well because I have a friend. Well, we're both done with exams, basically. I just felt like I had to update my channel because it's been a while and I don't really have an excuse anymore to not update it because I literally have nothing else to do with my life.
I can relate.
Basically, for today's video, we will be doing a comparison type thing. I would say, like a comparison between sociology and social anthropology. So like, for those of you who don't know, I'm a sociology student at LSE, and Sean here, my friend, is a social anthropology student at the same second year, both second year at the same university. I thought it would be really interesting to make a video sort of comparing the two subjects because a lot of people seem to like lump them into like the same category, lump them together in the same category. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but also there are some differences as well. And I think for anyone who, I guess, wants to study social science and are considering either anthropology or sociology, there are not a lot of good resources online, I feel, that really talk about, I guess, the differences between the subjects. And I guess, like, I just wanted to make a video addressing this because, like, the thing is, there are a lot of points of synergy, there are a lot of points of similarity between the two disciplines, but there are also a lot of points of difference. Sean, would you like to start by introducing yourself, I guess?
Oh yeah, so my name is Sean. I'm a second year anthropology student. And actually, I transferred from history to anthropology in my second year, but I do consider myself very much in anthropology. All of the modules I took this year were anthropology, and yeah, I think that's about.
This is gonna be a very awkward video, guys.
Heavily edited.
Heavily edited.
We'll just end up with like 5 minutes of material.
5 minutes of material. Everything
Recording was like an hour. We'll just end up with 5 minutes.
So, like, he was right, by the way. How would we define our subjects, basically?
So I would start off by defining anthropology like with a very basic definition, which is the study of human beings or humanity, but more specifically for social anthropology, like the study of human society and culture. I think anthropology is very much defined by its research method of ethnography. Like, that's what makes it unique compared to other social sciences. I like anthropology for that reason because it's about studying like the attitudes and the emic native point of view. Really try to get like on the ground and understand how people see each other, how people see the world, and that's like inherently relative to each and different culture. So if I could like summarize it in a nutshell, I think anthropology is the study of human society and culture using this ethnographic research method.
For me, sociology is kind of like, I think like the most base definition, it's the systematic study of like contemporary society, but I think that doesn't really get to the core of what it actually is. And I think for me, I've always sort of defined sociology quite recently as the systematic study of contemporary social patterns. So social patterns could include patterns of social relationships, but it could also include the arrangement and order of like contemporary social structures, taking into account like institutions and like aspects of like social life, and different social spheres are sort of like interconnected with one another, and sort of just trying to trace the patterns of these relationships. And so sociology is quite broad and quite structural in that sense, in that we're kind of looking at society from a big picture sort of perspective. I guess trying to like uncover all these patterns and sort of the way these patterns connect to each other, trying to like come up with explanations for the rise of the patterns we're seeing today and what effects these patterns have and how they're producing new different patterns of like social relationships. But how would you define sociology?
Sociology, I would define sociology, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think, again, to come up with a basic answer, sociology is the study of society, so naturally they would gravitate more towards like big picture explanations of what's going on in society, looking at the structural things like you were talking about. I was going to say sociology is more holistic, but I think anthropology can be equally holistic. In sociology, I think the questions about like the critical approach is more obvious compared to anthropology, where like you might gravitate in sociology more towards questions about inequality or
like power and stuff like that.
Yeah. Whereas in anthropology, maybe that's not so obvious. Obviously, those are themes that you will look at, but not up in front, like the foremost concerns on your mind.
I think, like, for me, how I would sort of define anthropology, and I'm saying this as someone who's taken like just one anthro module in his entire life, and someone who has family in like with an anthropology background. I sort of see anthropology as kind of like the philosophy of human nature. You know, it's very different from sociology, because sociology makes a lot of assumptions. Like when you go into like a sociological study, you have to make quite a lot of assumptions about society beforehand, whereas anthropology doesn't really do that. It's a little bit more inductive than what sociology is. It takes into account variation, because that's the whole thing about anthropology, is that like society is not this universal thing. There's so much variation when it comes to culture, when it comes to like values, attitudes, behaviors, stuff like that. And it's really just trying to unpack sort of like these like small details that we don't really that we as sociologists don't really like paying attention to, like the small differences in like how different people value, say, things like democracy differently, or how people value the economy differently, and how that's tied to like a very specific cultural and regional context. And sociology doesn't do that. We like to start out with a lot of like universal assumptions. Well, we're moving away from that now, thank God, but like a lot of traditional sociology does make a lot of like universal assumptions. It's hard to explain the differences between the two subjects unless you've studied them before.
Right. Sort of in action.
Within practice, like if you've studied both subjects, if you study both sociology and anthropology in your life, you would know the difference. But it's just really hard to explain to someone what the differences are, because at the end of the day, it's like it's the study of human society, and it's like that can mean so many things. Isn't that just the job of the social sciences? If the social sciences are the sciences that deal with the study of society, why should we have specific disciplines that look at the study of society already? Isn't that kind of redundant?
I also think, as a side point, but anthropology sits in this weird position between being, they say it's the most humanistic of the social sciences, but they also say it's the most scientific of the humanities. So I think anthropology occupies this weird middle ground between the two. Human beings express themselves through symbolic, or so there's a kind of flexibility there where you're not quite looking for a right or wrong answer, but it's more, what was the original question again?
Like every time we write an essay, what's the original? Actually, what role does anthropology and sociology play in terms of like the social sciences as a whole?
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I think anthropology is very enriching because it can kind of deconstruct the assumptions or the categorical frameworks we use to pose questions in the first place. Anthropology is inherently deconstructive compared to a subject like history, where in history we would talk about the impact individuals had on society, where anthropology would directly challenge that dichotomy and say, well, actually, is there such thing as this great man, like perspective on history where you only have certain individuals being able to influence history? What about this opinion that individuals are inherently social in themselves, they're always part of this greater collectivity? Anthropology is so useful for questioning and being critical about the theoretical terms we use to pose questions, because if we can deconstruct the analytical tools we use to ask those questions, then we come up with like different answers. Studying anthropology can be so creative and really open your perspectives to different ways of seeing the world.
I've always sort of understood sociology as the bridging discipline. Obviously, you would define any of the social sciences as like a discipline that deals with the rigorous study of like society, which is kind of like what sociology kind of already is, but it's also different in the sense that like it's making all these connections, right, between like different spheres of society. So you have like things like economics, political science, law, geography that look at very specific aspects of society, and sociology kind of like what it does is that it sort of bridges all of these things. Okay, how could we understand sort of the economy, or how could we understand political institutions by looking at the ordinary lives of people? And how could like the mundane world be used as sort of like a bridge to understand how these things connect to one another? And I've always sort of seen sociology as like the bridging discipline and the glue of the social sciences that allows us to like look at all these things holistically. I guess it does it by like looking at how these things sort of travel like across like the ordinary world, like the ordinary social world, and how these things are like inherently connected by like just people living their everyday lives. Like how do we as people experience like the economy in relation to like certain political decisions being made? How do we as like ordinary people sort of like bridge the connection between these two things, between these two institutions? Just trying to like observe how these things connect to one another from a very like bottom up kind of perspective. I don't know what I'm saying at this point. I feel like every sociology essay starts out like this. Like we're both like the more holistic of the social sciences.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think like how I see sociology is kind of like a bridging discipline. Anthropology is kind of like the humanizing discipline, I guess, in the way that it takes into account like variance and like symbols and like meaning.
In anthropology, we really appreciate how you are also a human being with your own subjective viewpoints, and as a result, the only way you can really understand what's going on in a human social and cultural life is if you participate in the activities, in the interactions. That's where I think, yeah, you need to have a lot of like empathy and sensitivity to how different people work, and to have inherent like respect for that. Your perspective is not superior to that person's view of what they're doing, but you can help to enrich like their understanding of what they're doing by having this like theoretical perspective. Yeah,
and in a similar sense, sociology, although unfortunately we don't really look at sort of like the details of like how people sort of construct meaning in their lives, what we do is like, I guess we look at the effects being produced within different social spheres and sort of like making those connections by looking at how the economy and how political institutions have affected certain people, right? And how these effects sort of like make these like interesting connections between these different institutions and how it inevitably constructs like a fabric of society. Really fascinating patterns which you can then trace across this fabric. Yeah. We can maybe look at the economy, for example. Because you've done like an entire module. I guess like what are the approaches that a sociologist and an anthropologist would then have on the study? We'll look at the economy as like an object of analysis in society.
With my knowledge of economic anthropology after doing a module on it, what I think the intent of anthropology is... Oh wait, those are two different things. Let me start. Okay, edit this out. I'm so terrible.
This goes like... There's like every single exam.
Literally.
It's like I'm halfway through and it's like... I had a point with this. And how would an anthropologist approach the study of the economy? And what are you then trying to figure out?
I think the economy is a really good example. We would then go to like concrete ethnographic examples of how the economy would work so differently in like different contexts, depending also on the theoretical framework which you used. I'm trying to think of a really good example. Anthropology will look at the history of the economy as a socially constructed concept. Then we would look at like concrete ethnographies to examine how that would look like in a context, in a social context. And yeah, how, because we're interested in the culture attitudes, how a really big thing in economic anthropology at the moment is looking at social theories of value. Like, it's something which anthropologists like David Graeber talk a lot about. It's just understanding how we shouldn't see these things as abstracted from a social context, but inherently human beings are social and cultural, and they will attribute different economic things, different values, depending on the culture that they live in.
Yeah, that's actually quite similar, like sociology, but we don't necessarily look at like cultural variation. We sort of understand the economy is not this abstract, rational thing that is also like constructed by people.
Yeah.
So I guess like you would say that the end goal of like an anthropologist studying the economy would be like, how can we understand the economy as sort of like something that is constructed or understood differently? How meaning about the meaning surrounding the economy and how people sort of like understand the economy differently inevitably affects the shape and structure of the economy.
Because typically there's this view that, the economy is materialist and it's objective, so a lot of the material theories are quite deterministic, but we would say actually the symbolic meanings and personal meanings which people invest into like economic interactions can be just as influential for shaping how the economy works and is structured.
But like economic sociology is very much understanding, I guess we're much more focused on like economic inequality and how like I guess economic inequality is sort of like entrenched. We spend a lot of time problematizing rational theory and neoclassical economic theory. How is the economy and how is economic activity sort of embedded within patterns of social relationships? And how is this embedded within power relationships as well? Looking at, for example, the labor market. What kinds of people have access to the labor market? What kind of people have access to like certain positions, powers, and jobs, certain like elite institutions? Why are there so many people who are like so rich, right, and extremely rich over such a long period of time? Why are there so many people who are so poor? And still continue to be so poor after long periods of time. And so what we're trying to do is that we're trying to understand sort of like how social factors have contributed to like our relationship to the economy. How has our place in society, our status in society affected, I guess, the way the economy is structured for us? Our income, our wealth, our savings, our assets, stuff like that. How that's all sort of determined socially. By our networks, by our cultural capital, by our familial capital. I'm going very Bourdieusian here. Oh, there's another point I wanted to make. Like institutional capital, like qualifications we have, like what kind of educational background we have. How does that influence our entry into the job market? And a lot of the times, economic sociology is very, very interested in questions of labor as well. I guess to take kind of like a Marxist perspective as well as how sort of the rise of capitalism as sort of an economic system disadvantaged some and advantaged others from a material perspective, and sort of like interrogating and problematizing the idea of the trickle-down economy, and interrogating the notion of social mobility when certain people are advantaged by capitalism by virtue of having much more capital, by virtue of owning property and exploiting property for the purpose of sustaining their positionality and their status, and how labor is sort of used to then create all this wealth. And so economic sociology is not necessarily super concerned with like how people construct meaning and how people value economic life like an anthropologist would. We're much more interested in sort of like the entrenchment of economic inequality and sort of the social dimensions of like how hierarchy has its grounding within like patterns of social relationships.
I think what an anthropologist would say, perhaps that's making too many generalizations, or perhaps we would rather try to approach those things like on the ground and understand how a lot of those trends are ingrained in like people's ideas or how people interact with each other.
When you were talking about like constructing meaning and stuff like that for an economic anthropologist, I guess the question I then pose is that, but what would that say, I guess, about like the big picture?
Economic anthropology is good in that way because it's looking at the ideas, like the attitudes and the perspectives. You could say it's like the subjective side of like a human's like social and cultural outlook. I think by starting off by deconstructing those assumptions, they help to deconstruct these like
overarching ideas of like what the economy should be.
Yeah.
I think sociology does something similar, but again, we don't really spend a lot of time sort of deconstructing cultural variation. I think that's sort of like a downside to sociology, but we spend a lot more time looking at sort of like the social structural hierarchies that are producing these economic inequalities. I guess that leads on to like, well, how do we differ in terms of methodology?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so like obviously social anthropology has a strong foundation in ethnographic research. So
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So ethnography is a study of people, which I know is a very helpful definition. So an ethnography is a qualitative piece of work which looks at kind of what I was talking about, like the attitudes of a group of people, and it's inherently qualitative. So it's looking at like the attitudes, the interactions. In a nutshell, an ethnography is just looking at a group of people's like subjective attitudes and their interactions with each other.
Would you call it like a participant observation almost?
Yeah.
Like an exercise in participant observation.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it is like making observations about a certain group of people.
Yeah.
Then using theory to sort of like theorize and explain why they are the way they are.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. Because
Yeah.
we use ethnography in sociology as well, but we use it in a slightly different way, in the sense that like the goal of a sociological ethnography is to study sort of the effects of a certain social pattern, right, or a certain social trend on a particular community and how they're experiencing the effects of this social trend. And obviously exploring themes of like power, inequality, and difference whilst doing that. And anthropology is very much reliant on ethnography as like as a core methodology, whereas sociology we use a range of different methods. So traditionally, you can have quantitative sociologists and you can also have qualitative sociologists. I'm more of a quantitative sociologist. Sauce, guys. So I use a lot of survey methodology and statistical analysis. So we use surveys to poll people's opinions and attitudes towards certain things, which carries a lot of epistemological baggage, I'm not gonna lie, but it's really useful in terms of like seeing an overarching picture of like a certain thing. Again, the findings are temporally specific, so it's taking a snapshot of how people are thinking about a certain thing at a very particular point of time. And we also use qualitative interviews as well. You can really go super in depth into how someone understands the way they're experiencing the effects of a certain social pattern or a certain social trend, a recurring social trend. It's really just going on the ground and just like talking to them and understanding, so how do you feel about this? How is this affecting you? What are they saying about the effects of this certain social arrangement? Right?
Interesting.
And
that
we
sounds
also,
systematic. Like
so like we have like a range of like very different like methodologies, and part of our research is understanding how to justify why we use the methodology we're using in our research. Why are we combining a survey with an interview? Why are we combining a focus group with an ethnography? So sociology is quite flexible and quite creative in terms of research design because of that.
I would say anthropology is more specialized in ethnographic research, whereas I think what you're saying is that it can be more mixed and
like the most creative part of sociology is research design, because you get to justify and explore different methods of like collecting data. What do you think are the major points of similarity then? I think we've sort of touched on this. We both use ethnography at some point. We both are trying to problematize general assumptions of like how certain things work. I think we can talk about the major influencers in which in both disciplines.
We touched on him already, like Bourdieu.
Yeah.
Bourdieu is a big one. He's very good at like connecting like traditional Marxism material theories of culture with like culture and symbolic theories as well, to understand how like inequality is reproduced through those forms. Did we mention like Foucault as well?
Foucault, Foucault. So, Foucault, the big F. Who calls him that? Okay, never saying that again. Foucault was like a really big figure in both sociology and anthropology. And so is like Butler as well. So mainly like the post-structural turn of sociology and anthropology is when things really started to converge.
Yeah, so we completely forgot about Marx, Weber, and Durkheim.
I think we've talked about this before. I guess like a major point of similarity between the two disciplines is that we're trying to problematize these ideas of objectivity and rationality. There is no rational way of like looking at and understanding a certain thing. And that everything is sort of like embedded within a social context. Like I think both disciplines can agree on that, I think.
And I think it's interesting to connect that maybe with the post-structural movement, because maybe you could say that arguably anthropology and sociology have been impacted the most by the post-structural turn, the reflexive turn, because you could argue that this whole idea that people are rational, or that there's an objective means of looking at people, researching them, is part of like the Enlightenment project of like modernity and progress, and how that has been challenged in the social sciences as a whole. And I think anthropology and sociology have a big stake in challenging those assumptions and thinking about what's next, like how can we research human beings in a way that's more meaningful to someone's everyday experiences of living in a society or culture, being more appreciative of like cultural differences, how that could create different possibilities in the future which aren't so premised on this idea of human progress, which can sound like teleological, but that's going into like the post-structural stuff.
There's a turn as well in sociology where we're trying to balance sort of the post-structural with the structural. It's quite a Gramscian, quite a Stuart Hall approach, where we're trying to understand sort of how the structural and how the material is being affected by the cultural and the discursive. Subjective meaning is influencing social structures, the social structures we're seeing today, and the social arrangements we're seeing today, and the way stratification is being experienced, and how that's sort of like embedded within discourses, and how that's being embedded within cultural values and norms and attitudes that we're holding as a society.
So what I got from that is that sociology is trying to balance the post-structural movement with a more structural...
the traditional structural roots of sociology.
Interesting.
Because
I think anthropology as a discipline, because it's so premised on ethnographic research, is very given to the post structural movement. It's hard to find like structural theories in anthropology, or if so, it's treated as like quite quirky or like quite like a throwback. Like it's not something you would expect. Like ontology has been a big hit recently, which some people are just confused by, because ontology is the study of being, but it's challenged like other post-structural schools of thought, like the cultural school or other schools of thought, which equally challenge like a structural analysis of human beings and society, but use different frameworks. So that's where anthropology would teach more like a flexibility in like using these different cultural theories, and understanding that they're just meant to be used as a set of tools. None of them are meant to give like an absolute concrete answer. The point is that by showing that flexibility, you gain a more nuanced and like understanding of like the subtleties going on in a social situation.
Whereas sociology gives you a range of possible answers. That's the thing, because of its like really structural roots. Our job is then to like sort of tease out which explanation is more valid than the other, which is why I always say that although I find anthropology more stimulating and challenging than sociology, sociology is much more satisfying and gratifying because it has answers, and
Yeah.
it gives you a range of possible answers which you can then sort of like interpret for yourself which answer, which approach and which explanation is more valid than the other in terms of like trying to explain the rise and effect of like particular social pattern. So how could we imagine potential futures for both sociology and anthropology?
I think something which has been quite big in anthropology, and I'm sure for sociology too,
Yeah.
like in the past 20 years, is looking at things from alternative perspectives, looking at like marginalized groups and understanding how they have their own perspectives which have been previously ignored, like in a Foucauldian way.
Yeah.
So I think anthropology will continue in that way. Something which is talked about a lot in anthropology is things like affect theory, so not taking even like the human being as an assumption, but understanding how different materialities or like objects can have agencies
Yeah.
in a social context too. So I think anthropology is moving in that direction as well. After a while, even theory to an extent is problematic because it's in a way imposing the theorist's own like categorical assumptions and their own ethnocentric outlook onto a situation. Rather, you want to understand how things work like in their context. What I can foresee, like anthropology will continue in that same vein, like looking at general themes of like gender, race, religion, or like sexuality and class, but always in that like trying to nuance it within like a context, both in non-Western countries and in Western countries too.
Yeah.
And also just to like add on to that, I think globalization in recent years has been an interesting trend which anthropologists want to study more, how you're blurring the lines between how non-Western countries have traditionally been seen as like the ethnic other and the rational West. Actually now you're seeing a blurring of lines between the two where analysis can easily cross those traditional national boundaries if you look at ethnographies of like immigration or technologies, things like that.
I think for sociology, the biggest qualm I've always had was that classical sociology makes a lot of assumptions about society as an object of analysis. It tries to treat society as this very culturally neutral object. Traditionally, sociology, the base of operations of sociology has always been Europe and America. It's just the West in general has always been the base of operations for sociology, and that's such a big problem because it's treating like a lot of sociological knowledge being produced about these societies as potentially universal. Which, I mean, yeah, you could always make an argument that like social theory could always be like expanded on and stretched from its original context, which is what we were doing in SO201, which is advanced social theory. We were talking about the potential of like certain like westernized theories of society and how they could be potentially stretched and adapted into different social contexts. You could make an argument for that, but also you can, which we also learned in the course, you can make an argument to say that all social theory and all sociological knowledge is provincial, and that it's situated in the context in which it was written and produced.
Yeah.
And I feel like sociology today is making a bigger move to like understanding society as something global and something that is not necessarily just Europe and America. That's not just purely Western. There's so many so many developing countries now that are not in the West. The whole point of sociology was to investigate like modern industrial society. To nowadays, modern industrial society isn't just synonymous with the West. There's so many more developing countries outside of the West. There's a movement now in sociology trying to understand how society is being structured with regards to these very specific contexts. And I think like the biggest fear a lot of sociologists have is that if we do that, then we'll become anthropologists. And to that I say, is that such a big problem though?
The reality is it's already overlapping. Like it already shares so many similarities.
I think like as we progress, all the social sciences will eventually overlap at some point. I definitely do think sociology is making a move to try and understand society from a more global perspective, without just relying on like a lot of universal assumptions, which a lot of classical sociology does. And in terms of methodology, we're adopting a lot of like really cool radical ways to research certain things. Like for example, I was talking to my friend Rebecca, you know her.
Yeah.
And how she said that she was considering doing a digital ethnography to like study online political communities. And I think that's so cool that like sociology is now embracing sort of like the turn of the digital age. So we're using big data analysis, online content analysis, internet studies and stuff like that. And I think that really lends itself to the study of like globalization and connectivity, right? Because media, and especially digital media, is such a strong connecting force for people across different cultural contexts. How is this now producing like new forms of like social patterns, and like how is this producing new patterns of social relationships? And I think sociology is beginning to embrace that, and I'm looking forward to it. It's gonna be so exciting.
Yeah. Like a popular like take on anthropological work these days, like trying to, like I said before, like study things which cross national borders into a more like globalized approach. I
think what's happening with our disciplines is sort of the inverse of each other. Anthropology is now moving away from like looking at things at a very specific cultural context, and now looking at how things are connecting to one another across like
I think.
Whereas like sociology is now moving away from like overgeneralizing and over universalizing a lot of its theories and embracing particularity.
And I would say too, like anthropology has been studying more Western societies in recent years. Like in one of my modules we would look at ethnographies conducted in like an English council state, or a lot of our legal anthropology case studies were based in the West. So it's become more topical.
Nowadays, especially with the rise of globalization, there have been a lot of like sociological studies on global stratification as well as global inequality, sort of centering, I guess, the global South in these discussions and looking at how these things are now affecting us, the global South, differently than you guys here in the global North. I say that as someone who's from the global South, just not implying that the UK is from the global South. But anyways, I think like this is the end of the video. I don't know if you've even come up with a conclusion as to whether or not sociology and anthropology is different. I feel like in the end we've sort of like agreed that like they're converging now. I think it's inevitable that like the two disciplines are going to converge. On Wikipedia, they say that the alternative word for social anthropology is anthroposociology.
Oh my god. That's just a tongue twister. Struggling to even.
Anyways, that's it. So I don't know if you found this video helpful, but then again, like I think that's the majority of like social science research. It is really useful. But anyways,
am I getting a first for this?
No, what was my outro phrase? I guess I'll see you guys next time, hopefully.